I'm very happy to be here today to officially launch the World Cancer Research Fund Cancer Prevention Report. And the title of this session is going to cover the recommendations, the underpinning mechanisms, and the policy implications. I'm going to be co-chairing this session with Professor Mike Leitzman, who is also a CAP-panel member and has been heavily involved in the development of this report. I would like to say that unfortunately Dr. Mark Gander from AICR was not able to be here, and very kindly Dr. Mazda Zenab from AICR has stepped in his place. No potential conflict of interest to report. So, as many of you may be aware, World Cancer Research Fund has been leading the work on the role of diet, nutrition, physical activity, and cancer. The report that we are launching today is the third in a series that looks at the global evidence on the role of diet, nutrition, physical activity, and cancer. As part of the Continuous Update project, a team at Imperial College London has been collating all the published literature and analyzing all that in a review systematically, that then a panel of scientific experts, one of which is Professor Mike Leitzman, is interpreting the evidence, making conclusions and recommendations that you are going to see today. The contents of the report will be found online. There are about 2,000 pages content. And also today we have some copies of the summary of the report, that there are some in this room, and also you can find them at the stand by the World Obesity Federation, which is stand 2. So, this booklet of 100 pages is summarizing all these 2,000 pages, and you can request it online. So we have been doing all this work on cancer and prevention, and it's really important to have robust evidence on understanding the effects of diet, nutrition, physical activity, and cancer, since the cancer burden is rising, and many countries are adopting a westernized lifestyle which is characterized by sedentary behavior and unhealthy diets. And it is predicted, as you can see on the left-hand side, that by 2035, new cancer cases will increase by 58% to 24 million cases globally per year. So this is a really frightening statistic, and that's why it's really vital to be working in the cancer prevention field, and especially because also, in addition to that, the obesity rates are increasing, that by obesity is also a very major factor, as you will hear today, of cancer. This is a summary matrix that kind of collates all the conclusions of the last 10 years, if you like, and are summarized here by exposures on the top and cancer sites on the left-hand side. I would like to point out that body fatness has been strongly related to cancer, and in this new report, we have 12 cancers that have been linked to body fatness. This is 5 cancers more than in the last report published in 2007. And Mike is going to be talking about the conclusions, the strong conclusions that form the basis of the recommendations. For the panel to make recommendations, they need evidence on mechanisms in relation to the epidemiological evidence. And Dr. Mazda Zenab is going to be talking about the plausible mechanisms for obesity. So here are the 10 recommendations that we have very strong evidence that they all work together over the lifetime for cancer prevention. I just want to point out, and Mike is going to talk about this more in detail, that for the first time we have 2 recommendations separately, 2 new recommendations. So we have separated out the sugar-sweetened drinks in one recommendation and the fast foods and processed foods. And the main reason for that is because they are fueling obesity, which is a very important factor for cancer. I just want to finish off and introduce the last talk, which is going to be more on policy content, by my colleague Fiona Singh, who is going to talk about having the right environment that promotes a healthy lifestyle in order to really follow the recommendations. And of course, government plays a major role in that, and Fiona is going to talk about that and also introduce for the first time the new policy framework that we are launching today as well. So this is the structure of the talk, of the whole session, and the first talk will be by Professor Mike Leitzman.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jutta. I have also no conflict of interest to report. Let me talk just a little bit about the Continuous Update Project, which is the backbone, basically, of the new recommendations. The CUP represents a rigorous, systematic, and ongoing program to gather, to present, to analyze, and to judge the global research on how diet, nutrition, and physical activity affect not just cancer risk, but also cancer survival, and to make cancer prevention recommendations. So the process is structured such that scientific research from around the world is continuously added to the CUP's unique database, which is held and systematically reviewed by a team of scientists at Imperial College London. Then an independent multidisciplinary panel of scientists, of experts, carries out ongoing evaluations of this evidence and uses its findings to update the cancer prevention recommendations and helps inform policy on cancer prevention and survival. Now, the judgments on the strength of evidence rely on predetermined criteria that are based on an accepted framework. The conclusions for each either cancer site on the one hand or each exposure are summarized within matrices, one of which you can see here. This is just a sample matrix. And only conclusions that are based as, that are judged to be strong evidence, so either an evidence level of either convincing or probable, form the recommendations for, form the basis for the recommendations. And to the right, you see the panel of slightly modified Bradford-Hill criteria of evidence that form the basis for the systematic review analyses and the criteria also for judging the evidence. So that is including, most importantly, the number of studies, what type of studies, for example, prospective studies instead of case control studies, the quality of the way the exposure as well as the outcome was assessed in the studies, possible heterogeneity between studies, of course, threats to validity such as confounding or bias, the presence of a biologically plausible mechanism connecting the exposure to the cancer site, and lastly, of course, also the magnitude of the evidence. So these are all important criteria that are taken into account in summarizing the evidence, formulating the recommendations, and then making suggestions for policy action. So one of the main pillars of the new recommendations is the association between weight gain, overweight, obesity, and cancer. So this is an area where the evidence is most consistent and very strong. In fact, the new report covers a total of 12 cancer sites, as previously mentioned. That is a total of 5 cancer sites more than was published in the last second expert report from the year 2007. Now, the new cancers that have been found to be strongly associated with obesity or overweight or weight gain are noted here in red, I've shown them in red. So that would be liver cancer, cardiac cancer of the stomach, the cancers of the mouth, pharynx, and larynx as a combined endpoint, advanced prostate cancer, and cancer of the ovaries. So those are the new ones. The others had already previously been found to be associated with body mass index. And so this is a list now according to decreasing levels of magnitude of the association. Strongest evidence is seen for endometrial cancer, where we have a 50% increase in the risk of developing endometrial cancer for each 5-unit increase in body mass index, which is weight in kilogram divided by height in meters squared. The list then goes down all the way to colorectal cancer, which on the one hand shows some of the most consistent evidence, but on the other hand has, in this whole list of cancers, shows somewhat lesser magnitude of an association with a risk increase of 5% for each 5-unit increase in body mass index. And so you see on the far right column the level of evidence, which is either convincing for the majority of those cancer sites or probable for almost half of those cancer sites. So in both senses, graded as strong evidence for an association, for a positive association between overweight, obesity, or weight gain and the development of these cancer sites. Along with the weight exposure, there's a second exposure that has also formed a very strong basis for the recommendations. That is physical activity. It's sort of also seen as a counter exposure to obesity, but it does not reflect just the absence of body mass. It's really an independent exposure, strongly determining risk of 3 cancers. Here also listed in descending order of magnitude of the association. So we see the strongest association between physical activity and endometrial cancer incidence, and we see a somewhat weaker but still strong association with colorectal cancer, and then finally with postmenopausal cancer of the breast. There's also an association, of course, with premenopausal cancer of the breast, also an inverse association, but that evidence has not been deemed to be strong, so it's not listed here in this slide. Moving on to the dietary exposures that have been evaluated in depth during the last 10 years and have been used to update the report and as well as the recommendations. We have the first 5 sets of exposures that all relate to colorectal cancer, either as a decrease or an increase in risk. Specifically, there's strong evidence that regular consumption of whole grains is associated with decreased risk of colorectal cancer. Foods containing dietary fiber, also decreased risk of colorectal cancer. Dairy products and calcium also decrease risk of colorectal cancer. In contrast, the regular consumption of red meat and or processed meat is strongly associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. We have the next exposure, alcoholic beverages, which is a single exposure, but it's related to a total of, depending on how you count them, 6 cancer sites. So if you take the mouth, pharynx, and larynx as one joint cancer site, then adenocarcinoma of the esophagus, liver cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and stomach cancer. Previously known were 5 of these cancers. New from this report is the association with stomach cancer. So that was a cancer site that had previously not been strongly associated with risk, and here in this new report, the evidence has accumulated such that it's now possible to classify the association between regular consumption of alcohol and stomach cancer as convincing. Another beverage of great interest and of widespread consumption is coffee. It's been on our radar screen for quite some time, had also incidentally been on the radar screen in the former report, but it hadn't quite reached the evidence level yet for any of the cancer sites. And here, new evidence showing that regular consumption of coffee is associated with decreased risk of 2 cancer sites, namely cancer of the liver, hepatocellular cancer, and endometrial cancer. Finally, glycemic load. is strongly associated with increased risk of endometrial cancer. We have another set of dietary factors which we summarize under the term special circumstances, which refers mainly to the fact that these dietary factors or foods are consumed regionally or only in certain geographic parts of the world, sometimes in clusters, for example. This pertains, for example, to arsenic in drinking water, where we see increased risks of not only lung and bladder cancer, but also skin cancer. Then for large parts of Africa and some parts of Asia, we see that aflatoxin-containing foods pose a risk factor of convincing evidence for liver cancer. The regular consumption of mate, which is a tea that is drunken scalding hot in certain countries and areas in South America, poses increased risk for squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus with strong evidence. The consumption of foods that are preserved by salting increases risk of stomach cancer. Cantonese-style salted fish increases the risk of cancers of the nasopharynx. And evidence coming from some of the trial data from the 90s and 2000s showing that high dose and regular use of beta-carotene supplements increases the risk of lung cancer, but this risk increase is restricted to people who either were former or are current smokers. It does not extend to never smokers. Finally, a dietary factor, if you will, breastfeeding has been convincingly shown to decrease the risk of breast cancer in the breastfeeding mother. Then we have, beyond anthropometry, as I showed you for the BMI data, and then physical activity and the dietary data, we have another fourth set of exposures that have recently been found to also strongly determine the risk of cancer, and that one of those risk factors is height, attained adult height. So there's something that in the development of children and adolescents that leads to the adult height. So it's obviously not the height itself that is the risk factor, it's a marker of a risk factor that is associated with a factor leading to greater longitudinal height, is strongly associated with increased risk of cancers of the colorectum, the ovary, the breast, pancreas, kidney, endometrium, prostate, and skin. So that's fairly consistent evidence, so there has to be something going on with developmental factors. That is something that's emerging overall in the report. And also, similar to this exposure, there's a theme relating also to development in that greater birth weight or its consequence. So not the birth weight itself, but factors that associate with greater birth weight are probably a cause of premenopausal breast cancer. And as I said, the mechanisms underlying these associations are not very clearly understood as to date, so more research in this area definitely needed and is ongoing. I highlighted the fact that body mass index or overweight, obesity, and weight gain were a prominent risk factor for a whole host of cancers, 12 cancers. And so because of the consistency of this evidence, the report and the third expert report contains a separate section on the dietary or lifestyle determinants of weight gain or overweight or obesity. With the idea that if there are dietary or lifestyle factors that strongly increase the risk, convincingly increase the risk of overweight or obesity, then they, by virtue of increasing the risk of obesity, indirectly would then also impact upon cancer risk, and so have been included in the report also as a novelty in the report. And so there's convincing evidence for a decreasing risk of weight gain, overweight, and obesity either through walking or aerobic physical activity. So those are the two factors, important factors. And then dietary factors that lead to a decreased risk are dietary fiber, a so-called Mediterranean type dietary pattern. We call it Mediterranean type because that's the way it was assessed and reported in the underlying studies, as well as having been breastfed also leads to a decreased risk of developing overweight later on in life, especially during the adolescent period. In contrast to that, there is convincing evidence for an increased risk of overweight, obesity, or weight gain for screen time in terms of lifestyle. And then when we come to diet, sugar-sweetened drinks, fast food, and so-called Western-type dietary patterns lead to an increased risk of overweight or obesity. And so, based on these findings, the WCRF AICR have formulated 10 cancer prevention recommendations that are shown here, and you've seen the slide previously in your time. We have these not as a list of foods or items or lifestyle factors, but it really should be more interpreted as an overall package, an overall lifestyle that not individual factors, but the combination of these factors really determine the risk of either increasing or decreasing your risk of cancer. So those would be, first and foremost, being a healthy weight and being physically active. Those would be the two on the bottom, this one here and this one. Then we have also equally important, a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruit, and beans. And then a second, or the next set of recommendations are to limit consumption of fast foods, processed foods, red or processed meat, sugar or sugar-sweetened drinks, and alcohol consumption. Finally, not to use dietary supplements for cancer prevention, for mothers to breastfeed their babies if they can, and for cancer survivors to follow the cancer prevention recommendations if they can. So those would be the recommendations as they stand. As I said, as an overall package, not in individual items picked out. And so when you see that package and you see the individual foods listed or lifestyle factors listed, you will obviously see that there's quite some similarity between these and the 2007 recommendations. That is no coincidence. It actually is reassuring to see that the evidence is very similar to 10 years ago, and it increases our confidence that the evidence is really based on strong scientific studies. And as I said, it's not the specific foods or nutrients, as more the entire pattern of diet and physical activity that in combination with each other determines risk. There's some emerging evidence that's also coming out from the report. Data are not quite there yet, but pointing in the direction that we are beginning to learn more about individual levels of exposures and also cancer subtypes. We haven't been able to do that previously, so now we can parse out, for example, risk factors for advanced prostate cancer, or for example, cardiac cancer. In the 2007 report, that was not possible yet. The cancer sites were treated as a whole back then. And then a second theme I mentioned has to do with body mass mainly, is a theme that the life course in general plays a dominant role, and for example, for overweight or obesity acquired during adolescence poses risk then for the decades to come for the individual. And the influence of height, I mentioned that prominently. There's something about height as a marker for developmental factor that leads to cancer risk. More needs to be understood in that area. And then new as well is, of course, the recommendations for cancer survivors. That's a completely new area, very emerging, not solid data yet, but evidence is accumulating. So this is my last slide. In summary, I hope I was able to show you that the third expert report provides a comprehensive analysis and presents a robust basis for science that can be used to formulate recommendations for cancer risk as well as cancer survival, and also offering guidance for future studies in this area. Thank you very much for your attention, and ready to take questions.
Time for 2 questions, please. Problem. If you can identify yourself and your organization. Thank you.
Umberto Cornelli. I am a clinical pharmacologist, teacher of the Loyola University Medical School in Chicago. Well, I enjoy very much your talk, but unfortunately I disagree with a couple of points, and I will focus on this. When I have to tell the students the story about the meat, the processed meat and cancer, when I went through all the data, I've seen that this trial put together hamburgers and ham from Parma, which are totally different kind of processed meat. Because in the Parma ham doesn't contain the nitrates, whereas in the hamburger you don't know what the meat is put out. So the question is what I should tell to my students concerning the processed meat.
Thank you for the question. So indeed, that is a question that we have asked ourselves continuously over the years. We unfortunately lack the databases that would allow us to specifically determine the really exact contents of the processed meat. We know that there's factors that can either be contained in the meat or be synthesized in the body as part of the meat consumption. Of course, there's much debate about the actual factors, but the database that we are working with does not contain or does not split out or parse out the actual individual factors, be it nitrates or heterocyclic amines or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or whether it's the iron. So there's numerous hypotheses that really need to be followed up, probably in smaller scale directed studies before we can learn more about the actual mechanisms. And I think for the students as a guideline, it's not a problem, to me at least, it wouldn't be a problem to present that quite frankly, that the epidemiologic data is showing us some signals, for many of which we don't have definitive answers yet in terms of mechanism.
Hi, my name is Mary Conkey. I'm a naturopathic pediatrician from Seattle, Washington. And my question is about carbohydrates and colorectal cancer. I've had some concerns about patients being on low carbohydrate or no carbohydrate diets as sort of a fad diet. And I'm wondering if the relationship between whole grain carbohydrates and colorectal cancer is purely fiber related, or is there some other mechanism?
Are you talking about patients now, or healthy individuals that develop incident cancer? Or
I guess it's more of a philosophical question.
More?
It's more of a philosophical question. I'm just wondering,
okay.
in general, for the whole population, if people are avoiding carbohydrates, if we'll see an increase in colorectal cancer.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll hear a little bit about the mechanism relating to carbohydrate intake, hyperglycemia, insulin sensitivity as one of the hallmarks of cancer development that also is covered in the talk by Dr. Janab. So I think probably it would be wise to put that question on hold and then have it be covered in the section on mechanisms. Okay. If you can wait that 10 minutes. Thank you.
If that's okay, we can leave the questions for the discussion that we have at the end.
A short one, a really short one.
Okay, if it's a short one, then go ahead.
Maya from Israel. Do you think, because of the data that you showed, that there should be special screening tests for cancer for obese or overweight people?
That is a difficult question. Probably not, because I mean it would not be feasible. The population of overweight and or obese people is in Western countries and populations approximating or even exceeding 60%. And so to imagine that we would be able to screen that number of people, we'd basically be screening the whole population. So I don't think it's feasible. And screening really is all about a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. So we really need to implement screening programs where we can, first of all, prevent false positives, of course, as well as false negatives, but then also present programs that are feasible and fundable. So I wouldn't recommend screening the whole population for obesity. Quick answer.
May I also have a very short question? Could you give an example for the supplements not to be taken for cancer patients? The supplement?
The supplement.
One example.
The clearest evidence is for beta-carotene supplements for current or former smokers. There is some evidence showing, for example, that high-dose consumption of multivitamins whereas it's not clear what kind of vitamins in the multivitamins it is, but that high-dose multivitamins are also adverse, for example, for developing prostate cancer. So the idea is that a healthy diet should contain all the constituents, micronutrients needed for both cancer prevention and avoidance of premature death in cancer survivors, and that should not be it should not be necessary to supplement that with dietary supplements, except for in certain circumstances, malnutrition, malabsorption. Those would be exceptions.
Thank you, Michael. So we'll continue with the second talk.
Okay. So I then should introduce Dr. Mazda Janab, who is a scientist at the International Agency for Research in Cancer in Lyon and has a long history in examining mechanisms leading to cancer, and will focus today on obesity specifically. Mazda, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much to the WCRF and to the organizers for their very kind invitation to me. I also declare that I have no conflicts of interest whatsoever pertaining to this talk. Over the past previous decades and many years, there's been a lot of insightful and very in-depth studies on mechanisms underlying diet and lifestyle, environmental exposures, and cancer development. And my intent in a basic 15-minute talk is not to summarize, is not to go into any detail of these, but just to summarize the basic understanding. And it comes down to something of this respect, in the sense that unhealthy dietary and lifestyle patterns, the energy imbalance, obesity, and diabetes that they may entail has metabolic consequences, such as hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, hypertriglyceridemia, and higher levels of growth factors. And then these cause a growth-promoting environment. Another hypothesis is to do with hormonal factors, that there are disruptions of hormonal metabolism, steroid hormones, and hormone receptor signaling, and so on. And this causes increased cell proliferation and decreased apoptosis. And a third hypothesis has to do with altered synthesis and production of adipokines and cytokines, leading eventually to increased levels of inflammation. Now, together, this inflammatory and proliferative environment over the long term is growth promoting, and the underlying understanding is that this leads to increased cancer development. One way to understand this concept of metabolic dysfunction is to look at metabolic syndrome, which is a cluster of metabolic abnormalities throughout the body. In this slide, I put up the results from a study based on the EPIC cohort, a large prospective European cohort, where the metabolic syndrome score was assessed by its three definitions, and the risk for development of colon and rectal cancers was also assessed. And you can see in the column in orange that the risk for colon cancer is increased with the presence of metabolic syndrome. For rectal cancer, the picture is less clear and not statistically significant. And by this slide, I intend to show two things. First, that metabolic dysfunction does appear to be mechanistically involved in cancer development, but secondly, that not all cancer sites are equal in terms of the impact of these underlying mechanisms in cancer development. That is exemplified here on this slide, where we show metabolic dysfunction with and without overweight, where we compared normal weight individuals or overweight individuals who are metabolically healthy versus normal weight or overweight individuals who are metabolically unhealthy. And we observed that with metabolically unhealthy individuals, irrespective of being overweight or normal weight, the risk for colorectal cancer is increased significantly. It's interesting to note that there is a large overlap between the risk factors for cancer development the risk factors for other obesity-related conditions such as diabetes or diabetic kidney disease, in the sense of inflammation, the role of the colonic microbiota, vitamin D, and variety of dietary and lifestyle factors. And this suggests to us that these exposures, the mechanisms, and the disease endpoints do overlap and are linked in some way mechanistically. Of course, there's a lot of questions that we don't know about these aspects. Does the association hold in all populations? Is there a sex-specific difference? Is there a molecular signature for obesity-related cancers or obesity-related disease that one can decipher? And are there molecular targets that then can be modulated or targeted for stopping these mechanistic processes? And importantly, are there gene-environment interactions and genetic predispositions, which is information that we know very little about. Another mechanism that I spoke about earlier was inflammation. And on this slide, I show results from the EPIC prospective cohort, where C-reactive protein, a sensitive but non-specific biomarker of systemic inflammation, was analyzed in association with risk of developing colon, rectum, or the combination colorectal cancer. And you can see in the top part of the slide of the graph with the association with colon cancer is quite clear. There's an increased risk with increasing levels of circulating C-reactive protein. For rectal cancer, however, the observation is a bit muddy and unclear. And by this, again, I want to demonstrate the role of inflammation in cancer development, but also that the mechanism is not necessarily fitting to every cancer site. Of course, one can think that inflammation is related to cancer development, therefore stopping inflammation would be related to cancer prevention. And indeed, this question has been analyzed recently in the multi-ethnic cohort study, another large cohort study in the United States, where individuals taking NSAIDs, whether it's aspirin or other kinds of NSAIDs, were assessed, and their risk for developing colorectal cancer was assessed. And on the left-hand side of the table, you can see the risk in men, and you can see with greater consumption of NSAIDs, the risk for developing colorectal cancer is significantly reduced. The same, however, is not true for women, shown on the right-hand side of the table, where the outcome was largely null. And by showing this slide, my intent is to point out the sex-specific potential of some of these mechanisms, that the effect in men and women may be different based on the cancer site and the exposure and the mechanism. If we look at the molecular level at the different details of the mechanisms, it's interesting that they line up almost very nicely with the known and emerging hallmarks of cancer development. And this shows us that going from exposures to cancer development through these mechanisms, those exposures being obesity, lack of physical activity, or unhealthy dietary patterns, can have a meaningful explanation through these mechanisms. There are a lot of emerging mechanisms that we are beginning to understand, and we require more in-depth research about. And this slide shows metabolomic profiling for understanding the obesity and cancer risk. Now, we know that higher body mass index and obesity is associated with a degree of metabolic dysfunction in the sense of changes and differences in circulating levels of a number of compounds, such as acylcarnitines, amino acids, phosphatidylcholines, biogenic amines, and others. And so to assess the association between these metabolites and colorectal cancer development, a joint project between IARC and the Imperial College of London looked at targeted metabolomics and the risk of colorectal cancer development, analyzing the metabolomics in pre-diagnostically collected blood samples. And it's interesting to see the metabolites, both positive and inverse associations. However, only 3 metabolites were statistically significantly associated with, inversely associated with colorectal cancer risk: histidine, equal, and a phosphatidylcholine. And it's interesting that these three metabolites tend to derive from colonic microbiome metabolism, which suggests that the microbiome may have a role in colorectal cancer development from this novel analysis. In my group at the IARC, we also looked at metabolomic profiling for looking at hepatocellular carcinoma, looking at the underlying mechanisms of this cancer, which has a very strong link to diabetes and to obesity, but also other etiologies, specifically viral, but also alcohol abuse. And so it's an interesting cancer to look at in this sense, to be able to dissect apart the different etiologies of the cancer development process. And in this study, based on a prospective cohort, the EPIC cohort, we looked at 4 different LC-MS metabolomic methods to get a wide range, a large spectrum of metabolites in different metabolic pathways. And the table that you see on this slide shows the top 16 hits that we had from the metabolomic analysis that we could annotate. And you see both inverse associations, shown in green, and positive associations with hepatocellular carcinoma for these metabolites, shown in red. And when you look at the speculated role of the metabolites in HCC development, it's very interesting to note that they come from a variety of different pathways. For example, retinol has a role in immune function and cell growth. There is components of insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. There are dietary components such as vitamin E metabolism, markers of liver function, and also markers of liver damage positively associated with HCC. Amino acid from meat protein. There are markers of microbiome functionality within the colon, food additives, particularly from sugary drinks, carcinogenic compounds, bile acids, which is another emerging underlying mechanism for cancer development, not just colorectal, but for liver cancer as well here, and even exposure to methylating agents and DNA damage. So untargeted metabolomic analyses can provide us insight into multiple mechanisms, multiple pathways, and multiple etiologies within the cancer development processes and its link to obesity. Another emerging mechanism is related to the microbiome is the integrity of the gut barrier. We know that the microbiome may be modulated by obesity and overweight, and the gut barrier may be broken down, allowing leakage of carcinogenic compounds into the systemic circulation. In this study, we analyzed serum endotoxin exposures as a marker of the functionality of the gut barrier. And it's quite interesting, on the top row, the results for men, we see a statistically significant increased risk for colorectal cancer with decreased gut barrier function, whereas in women, the association, although not statistically significant, is almost the opposite. And this highlights not only the potential of this mechanism as having a role in colorectal cancer development, but also, again, the sex-specific nature of some of the observations that we are seeing. I come back now to some of the discussions that Professor Leitzman had in his presentation, the association of obesity with cancer development. And it's important to note from some of the earlier data that I presented, it may be perceived that obesity is something that is measured at one point in time. And in all of our studies, it is. But the development of obesity, the link of obesity to cancer development, and the underlying mechanisms are long-term processes, taking many years. And so in this study, based on the Chances Consortium, which is an EU-funded program, the duration of obesity, overweight duration per 10 years, and the overweight years in units was assessed in a number of different cohorts and different populations with the risk of developing obesity-related cancers. And you can see that with increasing duration of obesity, the risk for cancer development is increased dramatically and significantly. And this suggests that there may be windows for cancer prevention in preventing obesity and even losing weight. And that leads me to my next slide, which has to do with weight loss intervention. This INTERCEPT study is a joint study between Mark Gunter, who was originally supposed to give this talk, and colleagues at the University College of London, where a number of obese subjects were enrolled and biological samples collected before and after either intensive weight loss, which is a very low-calorie diet, or general dietary advice for weight loss. And a number of molecular pathways were looked at. This slide shows the very preliminary results from the INTERCEPT study, where after 18 weeks of the intervention and a mean weight loss of about 20% in some of the subjects, large and significant decreases in growth factors, in insulin, and inflammatory factors were observed pre-intervention compared to the post-intervention period. And even down to the cellular level, with these two pictures showing the colonic crypts and the level of cellular proliferation in the crypts, you see before and after weight loss. After weight loss, there's a dramatic decrease in cell proliferation. Also, gene expression was compared pre and post weight loss. And you can see in this slide general changes with weight loss across the intervention period in gene expression, particularly genes pertaining to obesity and cancer processes. So weight loss can have dramatic impact on some of the underlying mechanisms for cancer development. I go now full circle again to the WCRF guidelines for cancer prevention, and this slide shows results from a study that we did in collaboration with Imperial College of London on adherence to the WCRF 2007 guidelines and reduced risk of cancer development at a large number of cancer sites and in total cancers. And you can see that with simple advice for cancer prevention, the risk for cancer development is reduced at a large number of anatomical subsites. And this suggests that simple advice, simple or even simple policy factors leading to the next presentation may be quite effective, but we still need to have a good understanding of the mechanistic underpinnings. So in summary, obesity and physical activity are risk factors for a number of cancers that I listed, many of which are becoming increasingly common. Nevertheless, we have a lot of unanswered questions around the causality, the specifics of the mechanisms, heterogeneity across cancer subtypes, and sex-specific effects. There is ample evidence to implicate hyperinsulinemia, hormonal factors, and inflammatory factors as part of the biological mechanisms for cancer development. Yet there are some vagueness in these associations that we still need to assess. And so future and other studies should look at very advanced omics methods, such as metabolomics data that I put up, and try to look at different study designs to assess the underlying mechanisms. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the many collaborators underlying this data, and again, the WCRF for their invitation, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Master, for the presentation. Now we have enough time to take a few questions. Anyone interested in more information about the mechanism? Maybe I should start with the question. The data showing the association between weight development over the lifetime and cancer risk was quite intriguing. Do we have any information regarding mechanism, in the sense that these mechanisms would run in parallel to those from which we know already that they are associated with obesity measured at one time point in cancer risk, or is there additional mechanism work to be done and evidence from which we could learn?
Your question is a very important one, Michael, in the sense that our assumption is that throughout the duration of development of obesity, that the mechanisms are likely to be the same, but that's our assumption. There's very little work on the impact of obesity throughout the life course, and whether the mechanisms that pertain to the link between obesity and cancer development at different time points in life are the same or vary. We may speculate that they may vary, for example, the impact on gene expression or metabolic dysfunction. We know that metabolic profiles vary by age, and so these aspects certainly pertain to these associations. The problem is that we have very little data on that topic and very few research infrastructures that can address these questions.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janab. It was a very nice presentation. I have a point. You showed that the relationship between obesity and cancer in different studies. And I was looking at carefully that in the EPIC study in Spain, the risk is the half, whereas in Denmark and the other country, using the same system because they are EPIC country, there is a very big difference. How do you comment this?
There is a point in what you say, in the sense that there are likely to be heterogeneity amongst populations with different exposures. So different populations in different regions of the world may not have the same associations, and this is one potential example. There's, of course, the concept of adjusting for confounding, and our studies were fully adjusted for confounding, but one can never address that concept of residual confounding, which may pertain in some observations. There is a lot of work to be done to understand these associations in different populations, and this is a good example of the need for that work.
Any further questions? Okay. That is not the case.
So we will continue with the third talk, the third and last talk, and that's we are now moving into how we are translating the evidence into policy by my colleague Fiona Singh from the Policy and Public Affairs Department at WCRF International.
Thanks, Jota. So I am presenting how we can translate the science that we've just heard from our two previous speakers into policy action. And just from context, the Policy and Public Affairs Department at World Cancer Research Fund looks primarily at the moment at diet and healthy diets. And we also focus on not just cancer, but all diet-related NCDs. And we look closely at obesity and overweight. So throughout this presentation, I will be talking about that wider context. So, I have no conflicts of interest. So my outline is today I'll be speaking about why we need policy action, firstly discussing obesogenic environments, then looking at the global targets that have been set by the international community. I'll then touch on policy frameworks and looking at an already established framework that we have developed, the Nourishing Framework, followed by introducing, and the main part of the talk, looking at our new policy framework launched today with a third expert report. We're discussing how it was designed, how to use it, and its intended impact. And then I'll be concluding by looking at next steps. So, although well-informed choices are important in influencing personal risks of cancer and other diseases, many factors, such as availability of different foods and the accessibility of physical environments for active ways of life, are outside people's direct personal control. So in order to effect change at a population level, it is therefore critical to consider the environment within which people are making their choices. So the environmental, economic, political, and social factors are important upstream determinants of the behaviours and choices that influence the risk of cancer and other diet-related NCDs. For example, these factors result in food systems that mean the food that is available to people is more processed and often high in sugars, refined starches, and fats, and environments that contribute to sedentary lifestyles. So these factors can also lead to health inequalities, as lower socioeconomic groups are more vulnerable to these affected by these upstream determinants. So therefore we need upstream policy to change these social and economic factors. And it is the government's responsibility to protect the health of their populations in order to create environments for people that are conducive to following our cancer prevention recommendations. So we advocate that public health policies that prioritise laws, regulations and guidelines are critical to preventing cancer and other NCDs. We also think it's critical that a whole of sector, whole of society approach is taken to have concerted effort in policy implementation. We think it should be led by governments, but there are other actors that are involved, including civil society organisations such as ourselves, national and international bodies such as the WHO, philanthropic and other funding organisations such as Bloomberg Philanthropies, and academia. It's incredibly important. Research is needed to create evidence base to prove the effectiveness of these policies and to help governments to be able to implement policies and convince their politicians and their public that these policies are needed, as well as other actors in the international network. We'll be building on this in a series of reports, as an aside, called the Building Momentum series, which will be looking at implementation challenges faced by governments. We'll be focusing on looking at the different actors and looking at conflicts of interest and how they can be managed in with those different actors. And that will be starting to come out in June. Moving on beyond obesogenic environments, we also have global targets that member states have committed to. And here are two examples that relate to NCDs. We have Sustainable Development Goals with a target by 2030 to reduce 1/3 premature mortality from NCDs. We also have the Global Action Plan on the Prevention and Control of NCDs, and that goal is by 2025 to halt the rise in diabetes and obesity and a 25% relative reduction in risk from premature mortality from the 4 main NCDs, which are often diet-related. Progress to date towards these targets has been insufficient and more action is needed. So we would advocate that a policy framework can support such action. So we think that policy frameworks can conceptualise, organise and package policies, can help plan, develop, implement and evaluate policies, and identify available policy levers and policy options, and then overall creating a comprehensive policy approach. So just to give an explanation of such framework, we have already in existence since 2013, the Nourishing Framework. It is developed as a well-developed example of a policy framework, and some people in the audience are no doubt familiar with the framework and the database that accompanies it. Just to quickly go through it for those who are new to it, essentially it's broken down into 10 policy areas, which you can see here listed from N down to G. And each policy area focuses on a different area of policy action. So for example, nutrition labelling, restricting marketing, using economic tools such as taxes, as an example. They're separated into 3 domains, which you see along the top there: food environment, food system, behaviour change, communications. The idea being that the corresponding actions and policy areas would contribute to increasing the healthy food environment, the food system, and improving the food system and creating behaviour change communication. So one of the strengths of Nourishing is the way that it categorises those numerous policy options to promote healthy diets into 10 overarching policy areas across those 3 domains. We also have an accompanying database that is a useful tool for policymakers, researchers, civil society organisations to check what is being implemented around the world by different governments. And there's now over 450 government policies in the database and over 100 evaluations of the implemented policies to give further evidence of what is working. So today we introduce our new policy framework. Our cancer recommendations provide guidance for people on how to reduce their risk by modifying their choices. And from a policy perspective, it can be split into these 4 main areas: diet, physical activity, alcohol consumption, and breastfeeding. So in looking at our framework and nourishing framework and using it as a foundation, we wanted to expand it to include what the science side of our organisation looks at. And we found that policy levers similar to those to promote healthy diets, which we just saw in the previous slide, can be used to promote physical activity and breastfeeding and reduce alcohol consumption. So broadly, these are measures that can influence the availability, affordability, awareness, and acceptability of healthy diet and active lifestyle. So, as I said, we used nourishing as the base, and we took and modified it to have 10 policy areas and expanding them to 11. So most of these policy areas on this slide have got similar policy areas from nourishing. They've been reworded, and we've added an 11th policy area, which is healthy urban design, which is up the top here. So that's a new area for us. And again, all of these policy areas can have policy actions that could affect all of those 4 factors on the right there. So we changed the domain names, as you can see, from food-related domains to healthy enhancing environments, systems change, and behaviour change communication. And we think that when implemented, policy frameworks have the potential to achieve system-wide change, which is what we advocate for. We think that the policy framework should help policymakers, as mentioned earlier, to enable informed policy development and strategic direction, and also civil societies to help monitor what governments are doing, benchmark progress, hold governments to account, and also researchers and academics to identify research gaps and monitor and evaluate the policies that are enacted after this framework is used. So now I'm going to take you through just a few of the different policy areas, so showing you how, looking at specifically how these policy actions could create environments that are conducive to following our cancer recommendations. So firstly, we'll look at creating health and safe settings. Got some example policy options on the screen, separated into the 4 areas: diet, physical activity, alcohol, and breastfeeding. These are just examples of potential options. I would signpost that in Appendix 2 of both the 3rd expert report and the side policy brief, which I have in my hand, which has also been launched today, we have a comprehensive list of these policy options. So I'm just going to give you a flavour. So, for example, in this particular policy area, governments could implement policies, nutrition standards in schools, workplaces, and health facilities. Physical activity, implement initiatives that optimise opportunities for physical activity. Restrict alcohol consumption in educational buildings, workplaces, and health facilities. And for breastfeeding, implement or expand on the baby-friendly hospital initiative in health systems. For example, Slovenia has a vending machine ban in schools, so no food or drink can be sold in a vending machine in a Slovenian school, alongside other nutrition subsidies and standards. Looking at fiscal policies, obviously a reasonably popular policy option at the moment. So the main 2 areas that can be broken down into is using economic tools such as taxes and or incentives and benefits. So you can see split here, you have health-related taxes, your sugar-sweetened beverage tax, for example, which obviously have been implemented all around the world at the moment, and our first brief will be reporting on that in June. Or you have an alcohol excise taxes as well, and then you have incentives, so for example, physical activity and breastfeeding. You have benefits or incentives to increase the behaviour, breastfeeding or physical activity. Now looking at marketing restrictions, so this one's quite easy to see how the policy lever can work across these 4 areas. You can restrict marketing in all 4 areas. You can restrict the marketing of food and drink, and you can restrict the marketing of sports partnerships and sponsorships of unhealthy products through sports events and physical activity events. You can restrict the marketing or ban alcohol marketing, and there's also now legislation to end inappropriate marketing of baby feeding products. So an example of that from a country that has implemented something in the space of breastfeeding is Botswana. They have a marketing for foods, infants and young children ban, across TV, radio, internet marketing, which we've heard of earlier this morning in the session before ours, and it has a very robust monitoring system to check that this has been enforced and if it's been effective. And lastly, just looking at healthy urban design, our new policy area. So this is a really interesting way to see how you can expand nourishing or expand a policy framework, again, to look at all 4 areas. So you can have planning restrictions on where food outlets are put in different communities. You can have transport planning policies, infrastructure that increases walking, cycling, public transport. You can restrict the density of alcohol outlets so that there's less vulnerable populations, for example, don't have a proliferation of alcohol outlets. And then breastfeeding. You can implement policies that encourage and support people to breastfeed in public. So an example is Barcelona, where they have an urban mobility plan, and they're trying to implement that at the moment. It has super blocks and other calming measures within the city centre, and it splits up the sort of residential area into these squares or blocks, and this increases the accessibility for walking, bicycling, and urban transport, and increases green space. So the brief I've already mentioned, we have a standalone policy brief. It's available online. I have copies here. We have copies at the World Obesity stand. It will elaborate much more in detail about what I've just spoken about and provide more implemented policies like that of Botswana than I've described in more detail. So I would recommend either finding that online or getting a hard copy today. So to conclude, more action is needed. Which is an understatement. So we have currently work at the moment, the World Health Assembly taking place in Geneva. My colleagues are there. And we have Dr. Tedros, who is helping to lead the charge on NCDs. And we like this quote because, it's very clear we have solutions, we have ideas, we have policy frameworks, we have policy actions, we have a database of over 140-50 policies. Countries are working, but what we really need is just more implementation of the policy options that we know exist, that we know work, and that we know can make a big difference. So our evidence-based cancer prevention recommendations can help inform policy action to benefit all, and the new policy framework can be used by governments to identify policy actions that, when tailored to their local context and specific needs of their population, which is crucially important, it will help make the environments conducive to following the 2018 cancer prevention recommendations as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for really outlining what has been done, what needs to be done, and it seems a lot needs to be done. So we have time for a couple of questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Kremlin Vikram Singh, WHO Europe. My question is actually to any of the speakers, specifically about the recommendations. One of the recommendations worded as, for mothers, breastfeed your baby if you can. So is it because of the weakness in evidence or for practical reasons you add this comma, if you can? Or do we not have enough evidence to say breastfeeding would lead to prevent cancers by reducing obesity or whatever the mechanisms we have looked at? Thank you.
Okay, so that question, I guess, was directed not at Fiona, but at me. Okay, thanks. Thank you for the question. Well, there are certain circumstances which sometimes do not allow a mother to feed her child with breastfeeding, and so the formulation of the recommendation just takes that into account. So if it is possible for the mother physically and mentally to breastfeed her baby, then that is what she should be doing, at least for the first 6 months of life, and then followed up to 2 years with co-feeding, of course, of other foods, then to continue breastfeeding. But it doesn't apply to all women. So the formulation was taking into account that it's possible that certain mothers are not able to breastfeed, and so we didn't want to be too rigorous in the formulation. No.
And I can say
thanks for clarifying.
There has been a lot of discussion at the panel meetings where the wording was kind of discussed, especially because of that point. I think Fiona can join us here at the panel and we can start the discussion. So we have about 10 minutes for discussion if you have questions for any of the speakers.
About the diet and meat. We, with my group, we are following 3 villages in south of Italy to compare food and metabolic syndrome. And we have about 600 cases, and we are controlling 250 different foods in the area. What we saw was that white meat is correlated with metabolic syndrome in women, not in men. So it is important how this white meat is produced, because the white meat you produce there is not the same that white meat that you produce in South Africa or whatsoever. You know? So I would like some comment on this, because it appears that red wine is protecting from the metabolic syndrome in men, and the fruit consumption is not protecting the woman. So where all these things are produced, wine, fruits, animals, I think is extremely important. We cannot put all the things together.
Thank you for these are important points that you raise. So, first of all this review, the comprehensive review is based on the published literature. So it's what is in the published studies that have been analyzed and then judged by the panel. So, of course, in individual studies or when there are new studies set up, we will be able to look at specific things that you are addressing. So that's a limitation, if you like. I don't know, Michael, would you like to add anything else to that?
No, other than I have no explanation for your observation that consumption of white meat in the studies that you cited would be associated with increased risk of cancer endpoints, or I'm not sure which endpoints they were, but of course that would be, my first intuition would be to take a look into the actual processing method of the meat, because the meat, as we have been measuring it in the Western, mostly Western studies, that's of course one limitation of the work that we've been doing, is that much of the work has been based in studies in either Europe, the US, some in Asia, but very little in other countries, where different associations may arise and then need to be specifically addressed. So the processing would be my guess, with the next step to go. Do you want to continue here then?
Hello, Louise Bauer, University of Sydney. Maybe this is Fiona or others could comment on how the recommendations are being linked in any way to the UN high-level meeting on NCDs and how that links up. And then a quick question, if I may, to also ask about child obesity risk. Is there enough data, or when will there be enough data to get a sense of the risk for later cancer?
So very much looking at the UN high-level meeting in September this year. My team especially is focused predominantly pretty much on the lead up to that meeting. So it's a key political opportunity for NCD prevention. And so we are glad that that expert report has come out this year to help boost the support and the advocacy that we can use to create and move the agenda, and showing these scientific links, which also the huge point to bring up is that there is a lot of evidence that proves that following the cancer recommendations from the previous report has had a huge impact on overweight and obesity. So that's something that we think as a main focus and as a great evidence base for calling for more policy action, which is then what we feed through into our policy frameworks and all our policy work. Second point was on...
Could you repeat the second question? Sorry.
Child obesity.
When would there be time to address risks?
Oh, okay.
When might it be?
Okay. Well, compared to the volume of data that is available for adulthood obesity, the data for childhood obesity is just really getting going. I mean, we do not have the kind of data yet that we would need to really specify exact time windows and exact weight increases during age periods, for example, in relation to the etiologically relevant time then to the development of cancer. So those cohorts are underway. They are gathering data and collecting them, but we will need several years before we will be able to, with confidence, present actual data and numbers in that area. So what we see so far is there seems to be a susceptible time window, especially during adolescence, and that translates into cancer risk several decades later. But the data are too sparse at the moment to be really more specific than that.
Yes, next question, please.
Next question.
Thank you, Liselotte Schäfer-Linda from Karolinska Institutet in Sweden. The policy framework, I mean, it's much more easily said than done. And the question is to you, mainly Fiona, how do we interact with politicians? Because after all, it's their decisions. And of course, we are a democracy, so we elect the politicians. But we find it's very difficult to reach them. So I wonder, what is your experience? How do you meet them? How do you discuss? Do you have any good tips how to reach them and convince them? But because after all, they come in different colors, and depending on your current government, you can be successful or not. So how do you interact with them?
So we actually, to go back to the report I vaguely mentioned in the presentation, we're doing a lot of qualitative research right now with policymakers from around the world who have successfully implemented policies from the Nourishing Framework, looking at 4 specific areas, and we are asking that it's a very big problem that we do come across public will and then political will, and trying to get these policies implemented and getting them through. And I mean, maybe you have your Ministry of Health on board, but then you have your Ministry of Agriculture, Trade, or Economic Minister that will be causing issues for, if anything, that affects their mandate. So I agree that it is a big problem. We are hopeful that things like this 30 expert report with the scientific evidence and backing, which all politicians want, evidence to prove, cost modelling, to say how this policy is going to be more effective, is a challenge, and it's a big challenge for anyone trying to push this agenda. So it is about appealing to that particular policymaker and what they need to hear, and what they would like to see in their 3 or 4 year term, however long they have. So I think the biggest, there's two approaches. There's a rights-based approach, looking at the right to, especially even childhood obesity, and pushing that agenda in the entity community seems to be quite a good new way of pushing for more change. But I think there's also an economic argument which you can use with governments, in that the NCD bill and the health costs that these NCDs will cause in the future with an ageing population are going to be catastrophic. And it's in the interest of national, security. So everyone seems to like that argument, that policies need to be put in place for prevention now. There's really no more time to waste. So hitting them in the pocket is always a good start. But I agree, there's a lot of work to be done, and we're hoping our series will provide policymakers and researchers with the answers.
Just a comment. I think it was very good that you showed the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think that's a way to go and to argue. Exactly.
The Sustainable Development Goals, I think that having NCDs included in those has really increased NCDs on the health agenda, but also the development agenda. So if we can tap into the development world and use that argument, that strengthens, again, pushing this up the agenda.
you. We can take one more question.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ho from University of Hong Kong. I have a question on the recommendation on alcohol to restrict, to limit alcohol use. Well, I'm happy to see that the recommendation is a bit stronger than WHO's recommendation to reduce the harmful use of alcohol. Given the strong evidence of alcohol on cancer for 3 decades now, and the lack of effectual consumption, I wonder why the recommendation is not to use it at all, but just to limit the use of alcohol. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. So again, there has been a lot of discussion by the panel about the formulation of the exact recommendation. So if you see the strap line, it's for cancer prevention, it's best to avoid alcohol. But the wording, to be consistent with the rest of the recommendations, is to limit alcohol consumption. But the evidence is very strong, and we do say within the goals to avoid alcohol consumption, but also to follow the national guidelines, because we really want people in the different countries. We cannot capture all the information, but the evidence is very strong and has been highlighted. So the main recommendation is to follow, limit consumption, follow the national guidelines, but for cancer prevention, it's best to avoid alcohol. So now Professor Leitzman will finish off with some concluding remarks, summarizing the session and also some research directions.
Okay, thanks again for allowing me to just give you some very brief closing remarks. I will not stand in the way between you and your lunch for very long. So in terms of closing remarks, I thought what would be a good idea is to just give you a few of the ideas that we have for potential future research opportunities, future directions, and I've listed them here in a few bullet points. I think what we need to understand more about, which the issue that is most pressing for us as we see the data, we see the patterns emerging, but we lack the actual understanding of why we're seeing what we're seeing and understanding the direct biological mechanisms. So much more work needs to be done in specifically that area, understanding why the epidemiologic data is showing what it's showing. Then, of course, the impact of diet, nutrition, physical activity across the life course is also an area that is just beginning to emerge in terms of the data. And there was a question from the audience about the childhood obesity. Those are things that we need to definitely understand in more detail. A third point is getting a better handle on our exposure measurement. Not only is diet very complex and notoriously difficult exposure to assess, particularly in population studies and in uncontrolled settings. So the quest is ongoing regarding the discovery of nutritional biomarkers and also markers, of course, of, let's say, physical activity. We have been guided and we've been aided in last years by moving increasingly into the era of accelerometers and new technology to assess physical activity. So we actually have objective measures of tracking people's physical activity behavior as well as sedentariness. And those data are just emerging. So the cohorts are now getting to the point where they're delivering prospective data on accelerometer-derived physical activity and then prospective data on cancer outcomes. So that is direly needed. We're waiting for those data to really become more abundant. And of course, also the measurement of obesity has largely been limited to measuring body mass index because of its ease of exposure measurement and the wide availability of the data in the cohorts. But what we, of course, need is a much better understanding of the body, not only the body weight as such, but body composition. So where the fat, how much of the fat is located at what part of the body. I mentioned a little bit the need to specify the cancer endpoints with more detail. So we now know that risk factors differ, for example, between prostate cancer in general and advanced or aggressive prostate cancer that then leads to fatal disease. We have similar distinctions with other cancers, But what we not know enough about is the molecular characterization of tumor phenotypes, subtypes that we are now gathering more and more information on. Then another emerging area is the study of cancer survivors. It's an area that's been quite active in the last years, and data are accumulating, but we need to understand much more whether the risk factors that determine whether a person develops cancer incidence in the first place differs or is the same as continuation of those exposures once the cancer has already developed, and then determines whether that person survives with cancer and doesn't die prematurely either of the cancer or of other causes. I also mentioned briefly that much of the data comes from Western populations, much of our data, and we definitely need more data on other populations, particularly in Africa, particularly in South America, and also in large areas of Asia, although Asia has stepped up quite considerably in the last years, and more data are coming out there already. And finally, Fiona's talk on policy has shown us that much has been learned. We know in theory of how to implement the policies, but what is needed is action and implementation research. So that is the new buzzword also for funding opportunities, is how to implement the science of what we know, how to implement it in actual practice. So that, just in brief, I would like to encourage you to share with us your work, involve and engage your own networks, help us fill the research gaps that we've pointed out, and join our call to governments to move the field of cancer prevention forward. With that, thank you very much. There's more information on the third expert report on the web, and the new report is out, so very much looking forward to continuing the work with and in interaction with you. Thank you very much for attending the session.